Sure. So welcome. So here we are in this moment in our nation, and we are all seeing what's unfolding. And we have witnessed the horrific murder of George Floyd, and we are standing back and seeing what happened even just recently with Jacob Blake. And I think all of us are experiencing this collective urgency. What we have found and what we now know more than ever is that conversations in our home, conversations in our communities, conversations here together can be transformative. And we asked them, what does it mean to be considerate? They would say it means to be kind, generous, and sharing.
We'll move into the story of ourselves. You've all heard some version of the story of America and how this country was born. And I want you to think about that story that you've been told that has shaped your perspective of who we are as a nation and who you are as citizens of the United States throughout this presentation.
We also had the rise of Black prosperity because Black people had no choice but to live among themselves. And as they lived among themselves, they believed in their own intellectual capabilities and the intellectual capabilities of their children, but they couldn't send them to white schools, so they built their own. The Negro American Revolution occurred in 1963. It was Black Americans orchestrating a nonviolent direct action protest in nearly 1,000 cities. Now, we've already gone through the history of what happens when Black people stand up, right? The whole white riots, the white terrorism, 100 years of that, right? We've gone through that history, so imagine what it took to ask young Black people in nearly 1,000 cities to orchestrate a direct, nonviolent protest against the conditions that were systemic throughout our society.
So in this early arrival of white humans to the home of brown humans, two core ideals came into conflict: individual ownership of land and resources versus a social contract of sharing the land and resources. So the new nation that they formed, they had the freedom to determine the course of that nation, and they determined that it was going to be a whites-only citizen. The question you had to answer that would define your state is, what are you going to do with your Black people? Slave or slave-free? Now, the Freedmen's Bureau, these are white radicals who believe in the economic empowerment of Black people, who believe in the equal humanity of Black people, who believe that Black people should be equal citizens with white people. This is a radical idea. That's why they were called radicals. All of this change took place because of the white radicals led by Thaddeus Stevens. And I urge you to read his story. His story is remarkable.
I'd love for you to think, and if you're comfortable answering in the chat, how does this story of ourselves compare with the story you've been told? And or what stands out from you? The first comment is that so many people were never told anything about Juneteenth. It's simply absent from our history books. And as we learn that and as we begin to understand that, it feels stunning and it feels unacceptable. Brian is saying that his wife was a history major in college, and in the American South, you were told that slavery of Blacks was just one of many issues behind the war, not the main reason.
Is, can we change what we inherited? And the answer is yes.
Absolutely, yes.
Which is a great answer. This discussion of racial hierarchy, white supremacy, and the introduction of this into this continent and the taking of land and resources is an uncomfortable thing, but we didn't do that. It was done in the past. We inherited, we are beneficiaries of that. The opportunity we have, though, is to create a better society that is aligned with our ideals, our values, and the truth. The truth doesn't change.
And speaking of emotion, what we find continually in our home is that we as adults can bring emotion to conversations that children don't have. Children are incredibly responsive and resilient to truth, and they love hearing it in simple terms, and they take it and they move on to the next thing. So we sort of have a lot of angst that, oh, this is going to be a really hard conversation, and with our boys, it's like, oh, and this, and oh, okay, and then we move on. And if that's woven into your everyday, just as fact, just as truth, not as as emotional, heavy sort of anything. Our boys just have a database, and so it's just sort of a part of their understanding, because we want to raise children that are grown adults who understand the story and aren't going, this can't be, I'm shocked, I'm incredulous about this. Well, we're not incredulous. This is in plain sight right before us, and we just talk about it.
So what we're talking about today and what we hear across our nation today is racial equity. Everybody has a priority on racial equity in education, in economics, in housing. We hear the term racial equity all over. But what we don't hear is, how do you get there? How do you measure it? How do you know when you succeeded?
Where is the insertion point for change right in my sphere? And as our minds sort of illuminate to what that looks like in our sphere, then we actually do. And I see it happening. I see it in our circle. I see it in my friends who say, oh, I don't know, Emily, I don't even know where to start. And then they call me and say, well, I just have this idea. As I've learned about the schooling, I've started asking more questions, and the questions led me to this thing. And here's what I suggested. And I go, that was the next step. And it was an effective step. So we ask the question, the answer comes next, and then we know our next step.
Yes, and we want to make sure that we give practical tools.
Yeah.
We want to talk about embodied practices. Thank you, Jim.
Yeah.
And those will be part of our 5-week journey that will actually act out what we learn. We'll apply it. And that pathway to racial equity that you saw before, we will apply those principles.